Hey everybody, put together some thoughts about hybrid learning. If this is new for you, this is going to be an introduction. And if you kind of forget about hybrid learning from last year and you're returning, here's your refresher. So we're going to jump right into it. So today, what we're going to be looking at is the hybrid teaching model, some basics about it, and then just some of the things that I kind of learned from last year as well. If you need any help, feel free to just reach out to me, pcanapil@parkerschoolhawaii.org. There we go. So really quickly, just the three models of instruction. The first one being in person. That means all of the students are in person as we all work for the most part last week. Secondly, all students being remote. That would be considered remote learning. That's everyone is learning either synchronously, which is over in person over Zoom, or asynchronously, which is not over Zoom, using Google Classroom as the space to teach and learn and assess and give feedback. And then the last is the hybrid, which is a combination of in-person and remote, but there's multiple ways of doing that. And so what I'm going to do is share a couple of different hybrid learning models. So the first hybrid learning model is kind of the entry level one. This is the basic one. This is essentially the idea that your students who are remote learning are going to Zoom in during the class session and learn synchronously at the same time. There are some challenges with this that I've learned, which the first one being is this is often results in Zoom fatigue, meaning that kids are tired of looking at a screen all day long. You also have a hard time getting engagement out of a student who's over Zoom while the rest of the class is in person. But the good news is that there's minimal change to your instructional style, your preparation, your lesson plans, your pacing, and things like that. This is something that you might want to consider if students are expecting to remote learn for a shorter period of time. And we're going to talk about some tech support that you might need later as well. So another version that you might want to consider is something called a flipped classroom. So here, a teacher will post a video of themselves similar to what I'm doing here, a screencast or a lecture or whatever. And then students, both in person as well as remote, will watch the videos. They can do that as homework, or they can watch the videos as classwork. And then you can give formative assessment to kind of track the learning and figure out where you need to group students to give them support, give them diagnostic checks. At this point, all students should have Zoom open so that you can group kids who are in person as well as remote to say like, okay, this group of 9 didn't really understand the assignment or the lecture. So I want to kind of follow up with this group of 9. 4 of them are in person, 5 of them are remote. So I'm just going to put them all on Zoom, have the ones who are in person go off somewhere in school where they're going to find some privacy, and then we'll all Zoom in together and I can give that feedback to them. It's also an opportunity for kids to be able to meet and collaborate if you structure that into your class. And it requires a lot of management and communication. I will 100% attest to that, as I did this last year. It's a decent amount of work outside of class in the setup. You know, you have to record your videos. You are commenting constantly in Google Classroom. You're giving kids feedback on their work. You're annotating their work. You're setting one-on-one Zoom meetings. And it worked really well in a math class that I taught last year, where it was, this is the content I'm going to teach today, and putting it out there. And then lastly, the last model I kind of thought about and practiced last year was more of like a projects focused model. So in this part, you usually start the class with kind of the project or expectation, or the series of classes if this is a unit. Your remote students will Zoom in. And then at this point, once you've kind of gone over the project and the expectation, you will have one of the people in the groups who are in person also Zoom into the class Zoom. And then you can split up everybody into breakout rooms. So you'll have 3 people who are in person in class. One of those people is going to Zoom in. So the device will be the face of the remote students who are going to also be grouped in. So if you have 2 students who are Zooming in, you can stick them in the breakout room with that in-person group. So then you have a group of 5. And they can communicate in person as well as remote. And then at that point, as a teacher, I've done this in my science class last year, I would just rotate between groups to just kind of check in and encourage students who are remote to participate, as that's one of the challenges. Because it's really challenging, there's when you're Zooming into a group of people who are in person, you really feel like the odd person out. And so expectations about participation and maybe even practicing, it becomes really, really key. So there were some tech issues and troubleshooting that I was able to figure out last year. I'd love to share some of the tips I have here. So the first is with Zoom. Make sure that your Zoom link is on your Google Classroom. If you're going to have a Zoom link for each individual class, that's fine. If you're going to do one Zoom link for the entire year, also fine. Make sure it's in the resources section in your Google Classroom. Second is to make sure you start your Zoom at least 5 minutes before the actual start of class. That will give you enough time to figure out any kind of tech issues that you're having instead of class starts and you're like trying to figure out what's what and who's who. Next, make sure that you have a waiting room enabled when you're setting up your your Zoom meetings so that students can sit in the waiting room, and only admit students who have their names in the profile. That has been kind of an issue and it shouldn't be, but when students are Zooming in, they should always have their complete name, no nicknames, no joke names, none of that, so that we only are admitting people that we know are part of the Parker School community into our Zoom meetings. There's also Zoom expectations for our remote students. So these are things like having your camera on, squaring up in the screen. Sorry, my battery's down, let me plug in. Squaring up in the screen is an interesting one. That means exactly what I'm doing right now. All of my body and my head is in the screen when I'm learning. And it shouldn't look, this is the opposite. And for whatever reason, this often happens with a lot of our students. So make sure that you're asking them to square up in the screen, which means their entire face and body is in the screen. As you start class, if you're missing students from a Zoom, you might want to also just have your email up side by side or on a separate screen, just because there can often be kids or students who are having trouble with the Zoom link or lost the Zoom link or forgot it or whatever, something's glitching, whatever the reasoning being, so that if you get that email, you can just boom, send them a Zoom link really quickly. And then lastly is the chat function, which can be really, really useful, but make sure that the students are, they can chat to directly message you to ask questions. They should not be able to directly message each other. So you can have a general chat where everybody's chiming in and everybody can read everyone's comments. You can also set it up so they can directly message you, but you should not have two students who have the ability to directly message each other. When it comes to the actual classroom itself and the Promethean board, for those of you who are lucky enough to have a Promethean board, the first thing is that your computer is going to need to have the drivers to be able to connect to the in-class cameras that we set up last year for possible remote learning. So if you haven't figured that out yet, make sure you contact tech support as soon as possible on Mondays, or myself, and we can try to figure out how to get you connected to those in-classroom cameras. Your actual camera during a Zoom meeting should be that camera that's on the wall, unless you're meeting one-on-one, face-to-face with a student. It's best if you're using that on camera on the wall, then the students can see the classroom itself. The same thing goes with your microphone. The microphone on your computer is best when you're talking right into it, but when it's in a large classroom, the cameras that we set up, those microphones with those speakers, they're much better suited for a large classroom. And then there's the sharing your screen over Zoom. So this is a great resource. So if you have a slideshow, if you have a document you want to look at, you have some simple activities, that's fine. But something we learned last year was if you're going to share a video from your computer through sharing your screen, it does not stream well over Zoom. So if you're on the other end, if you're a remote learner and watching this video from your teacher, it's going to be choppy. It's going to be, as the kids say, lagging, or laggy. It's going to be all over it. And you might hear the sound, but it's not going to be a pleasant experience. So one of the things I did was I would take that link and then I would put it into the chat and say, okay, we're going to watch the video in person. So you go and watch the video and we'll meet back here in 9 minutes, because that's how long the video is. So at this point, when you're thinking about remote learners with your in-person learners in this hybrid model, Google Classroom becomes absolutely a key component to your teaching and how you run your classroom, because it's going to be your primary means of communication. Kids are going to be looking at their emails second to Google Classroom. This is at least from my experience. Commenting on assignments and grading assignments, annotating work using an iPad or whatever other device you might have to be able to annotate directly on. Or if a student has Google Doc and you can comment on it or edit on it, this is the best way to actually be talking with the student. And if we're in person, these are things that we do very, casually, I lean over, I see a student's work and boom, boom, I make a couple marks on their paper or just giving them some tips. And that doesn't really happen as well when you're remote. And so Google Classroom is going to be those casual kind of moments, those candid moments of just providing a little bit of support for students. Next, there's going to be probably some deadline flexibility that you're going to have to practice, especially for remote students who are going to be juggling quite a bit during this time. So just be flexible when it comes to giving them multiple opportunities to turn in work. Obviously, things will start piling up. And at a certain point, you're going to need to reach out to us so that we can also support the student as well. And then one way you can support that is putting as much of your assignments and your work out there ahead of time as possible. So this gives students plenty of time to pre-read the assignments, generate questions, and just generally be prepared for class. Now, I did that last year. I ended up putting out an entire unit at a time. And the feedback I got from my students was that it was anxiety inducing. It was like suddenly they had all these due dates. And so you might want to schedule the posts of some of the assignments themselves. But I think eventually, once they got used to it, it was actually really, really helpful. And then the last thing is we have a remote learning plan that has a ton of resources in it, guidelines for how you should be teaching and running your classes, suggestions for how you should be teaching and running your classes during this kind of hybrid phase. And I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that as well. There's a bunch of really, really useful things. And this document was generated by a task force of teachers that I think it was like 2 summers ago. And we put it together as recommendations for the possibility of having a remote learning, but it's also applicable to our students who are remote learning in a hybrid session. So that's kind of it. The last thing I'll tell you is you can do it. And this is the message you're also going to need to communicate to your students who are remote learning. It's kind of, it's tough for them. I know it right off the bat. They're going to be a little bit frustrated. So be patient with them as you go along. Understand that participation as a term is relative. It's not the exact same thing when a person is zooming in as it is when they're in person. So be flexible with your expectations, but also what qualifies as participation. And I wish you all the best.